One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. Chad Orton is an archivist with the Family and Church History Division of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He received his B.A. and M.A. in history from Brigham Young University. He's written on a wide variety of historical topics, including today's subject, the rescue of the Martin and Willie Handcart Companies. Chad, welcome once again to Legacy in the Mormon Channel.
Thank you.
We've had Chad several times on the program talking about some of the funny stories coming to the Valley, and also with your book, 40 Ways to Look at Brigham Young. Anyway, tell us what you've been working on lately.
Well, my current assignment at the with church history is with historic sites, and we recently completed some major work regarding the Beehive House. For those who haven't been for a while, if they visit the Beehive House now, they'll see some things that are different as far as how it's the layout of some of the rooms. We've also gathered together what we call a site guide for the missionaries to work with, containing hopefully some new stories that are familiar with people that as they go through, they'll come to appreciate Brigham Young even more.
Oh, very good. That sounds exciting.
It's been a lot of fun. Today
we're revisiting the Willie and Martin Handcart Company story, and I took from the notes that I have today your article, the Martin Handcart Company at the Sweetwater, Another Look. What did you write that for?
Several years ago, I became aware of the fact that the story as told didn't necessarily always fit in with the historical evidence that we have now. And one of the things I became very concerned about with the story was an aspect of it that I thought was undoctrinal. The idea that the boys, as the story is told about the three boys who carried everyone across the Sweetwater, would be promised eternal life for that one act alone. That goes against much of what is taught by the brethren here in the And I got looking into it, and I discovered that there were other aspects of the story that were incorrect. And I was hoping that by putting the story in its proper context, we would come to better appreciate the rescue effort and the heroic efforts of these men and boys who left their home to go out and help strangers at the peril of their own lives, and that we would really come to better appreciate the story itself. I've discovered in my experiences that I love this story, and I've discovered as I looked at so many stories in the church that if stories I didn't like was because I didn't understand them fully within its context, or and so by doing this, I was hoping that people would come to appreciate the story. Make it more applicable to their own lives, and thereby strengthening their testimony more of the restored gospel and what happened with these pioneers.
Very good. Let's take a step back and just kind of discuss the handcarts generally and how it all came about, what decisions were made to have handcart companies, and let's look a little bit into that.
Very good. And that's one of the stories that people don't always understand regarding the handcarts. There's an idea that we used handcarts for a wide period of time. That is not true. The handcarts were used between 1856. The last company was in 1861. There were 5 companies who came in 1856. The last 2 we were very familiar with, the Willie and Martin. But it was only for a brief period of time. And we've seen people talk about that their ancestors have come in the 1847 Brigham Young Handcart Company. And we tend to view the handcarts as the entire pioneer experience. only about 5% or less of those who came between 1847 and 1869 traveled by handcart. And the reason why they used the handcarts was that they had started, Brigham Young had started the Perpetual Immigrating Fund that would help pay for the Latter-day Saints to immigrate to Utah. And then once they got here, they were to pay back the money that they had borrowed. Through various circumstances, by 1855, the fund was out of money. They could no longer continue to immigrate the way that they had, which is by wagon. And Brigham for years had desired to try this experiment with the handcarts. He had seen, as well as others had seen, those going to California to the gold rush in 1849. And there was one man that many people commented on who went by wheelbarrow, who was going to California pushing a wheelbarrow. And Brigham Young concluded that if this man could go after his God, which was gold, by a wheelbarrow, that the Latter-day Saints could go after their God by a similar means. And so in 1856, that year, they implemented the handcarts. And Brigham so much wanted, there's a great letter he wrote to his son-in-law who was in England, said, "I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I think I could bring saints through quicker than's ever done before. But since I'm not there, would you be willing to try it?" And I think that says a lot about Brigham the man, who wanted to be there as the leader and to try this out. One of the views of the Latter-day Saints tends to be that those who came by handcarts were probably more righteous or more faithful than others, but it was simply that they were, to use the vernacular of the day, they were using the program that the Brethren had put in place. And a few years later, that program would change. A few years before, it was different.
So was it economics as well as other things? Or
yeah, it would cost a fraction to go by handcart. There were great expenses in getting hold of cattle or oxen to pull the wagons. A big wagon versus a small handcart. Yeah, it was largely economics.
In your article, you mentioned that some of the better built or commercial built handcarts were the ones that stood up better. How were handcarts made, or how did it come about when they started their companies back east?
They tried initially, again, one of the problems we have with this handcart experience is that there were a lot of dominoes that led to the tragedy of William Martin that fell into place. Brigham Young had got together. He sent some instructions on how to build the handcarts. And they originally tried to get these made professionally in St. Louis and then shipped up to Iowa. But somewhere along the line, there were so many Latter-day Saints who came along that they could no longer rely solely upon these professionally built handcarts. And the first companies used most of those. The later ones, they did have some of these professionally built handcarts, but they had to stop and build the handcarts themselves on sites. And there were some of the problems with the material because it wasn't of the same quality that was being used by the professionals. They just had to work with what they had there.
And so one of the stories that I've heard all my life is that the materials that they used to create the handcarts, the wood wasn't cured or it was still green or something and caused some of the problems. Is that true? Or
that's part of that led to some. I mean, the wood, whether it wasn't cured strong enough, was green. They tended to break more often than the professionally built handcart. So yeah, there were some problems in that regard that did slow them down. As we know, as a result of the fact that they had to wait for these handcarts to be built, they ended up leaving, they being the William Martin companies, about 2 months later than Brigham envisioned when they should be leaving from Iowa City. Brigham was hoping that these Latter-day Saints would be there about the middle of July, late July, early August, so that they could start making preparations for winter.
So this is something that Brigham had long wanted to try, and was generally successful. What we think about the tragedy of the Willie and Martin handcar companies, but there were others that made it without a problem.
Yeah, the first three handcarts, there were no problem. They came through just as anticipated. They didn't come. The one difference may be that they didn't come as fast as Brigham envisioned, but they still made it quicker than did wagon trains. The two companies that had problems, the Willie and Martin, there were a number who died, but the deaths in the other 7 companies were comparable to those of wagon trains at the time.
So, as an innovator, did he came up with this, and were there other techniques for getting saints back west that Brigham Young tried over the years? Or?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I love about Brigham, and one of the lessons I think we can learn, is he was never fully satisfied with the way things were. Just because something was working, could we not do it better? And so following the handcarts, which there were 5 companies afterwards that proved that it could still work, the Latter-day Saints were reluctant. But in 1861, he hit upon this idea, what were called down and back companies. And what they would do is early in the spring, they would start a company of wagons from Salt Lake City that would be loaded with goods. They would take them to east to the Missouri River. They would then sell their goods, pick up immigrants. Their wagons would then be empty. They would pick up the immigrants and head back to Utah. And what is fascinating about this is that everybody knew you couldn't do that until somebody actually tried it. And then they realized how well it would work. And one of the great things about this innovation taking place at the time is 1861 is the beginning of the American Civil War. So they would not have been able to get the goods that they wanted back east if they had gone back to the regular wagons, but there were now ready markets for their supplies back east because people were fighting battles rather than growing crops. So through this innovation, Brigham was it was a great boon to the saints, this program. And one of the things I loved about Brigham is he was constantly wondering, could this be done? There was a period of time where he tried to see if we could travel as immigrants up the Colorado River. Would that be the easiest way, the cheapest way, the best way to get the Latter-day Saints? Eventually proved impractical, but Brigham was always willing to experiment. And then, of course, when the railroad came in 1869, there were few ways he could find that were better than that.
That's true. So the converts coming from Europe, were they used to overland travel, or was this totally new to them?
This would be absolutely new. When you lived in Europe, most of these immigrants had lived in one area, they were born in an area, lived in an area. Very few would have traveled but few miles from where they were born. You just tended to stay in one place. In America, that is totally the opposite. Americans at the time were a nation on the move, where you continually moved and undertook these long travels. Very few of them would have been prepared for this experience. Wallace Stegner gives this great description, and I don't have it in front of me, of how hard this would be because no one had done this before. These immigrants, they'd gotten there and they were expected to pitch tents, build campfires and do these things that no one had any experience with. They had never walked. You walk a couple of days as this company, and that's probably more than most of these people had traveled at any one time in their life.
One of the pioneers that you quoted in your paper quite often was Patience Loder-Rosa. Is that the right way to say her name? She gave a description of when she finally found out that she was going to be part of this handcart company, of how she felt. She said, This was a terrible, great surprise to us all. At first, we felt we never could undertake to pull a handcart from Iowa to Salt Lake City, and my poor mother in delicate health. She had not walked a mile for years, and we girls had never been used to outdoor work. I think I felt the worst out of all the family. I could not see it right at all to want us to do such a humiliating thing, to be harnessed up like cattle and pull a handcart loaded with our bedding, cooking utensils, and our food and clothing, and have to go through different towns to be looked at and made fun of, as I knew we would be. It was very hurtful to my feelings, yes, I would say to my pride. So this seems like, as you described, very, very proper, regular people who had never conceived of this type of travel.
Absolutely, and and that's a very good description. For a lot of them, they couldn't understand why this idea, because it was so new, so different. But yet they were willing to do it, which I think says a lot about them.
So let's talk about the rescue. Let's go into the circumstances that brought them to the Wyoming plains in such dire circumstances.
Well, as I noted previously, these companies left a little bit later than was anticipated. The last of the three immigrant companies arrived in late September. Brigham Young had not received word that there were any more immigrant companies on the plains. They were having the traditional October conference, and the night before conference, Franklin D. Richards arrived and told Brigham that there not only were two more handcart companies, but there were also two wagon companies still on the plain. Those are the Hunt and Hodgett wagon companies. And Brigham Young is taken back because one of the things that they tried to do, the idea with these handcart companies, is that they would leave supplies at strategic locations. So, I mean, it would have been impossible for them to carry all the supplies that they needed in their handcarts and the wagons that went with them. And so when Brigham Young learns that there are handcarts on the plain still, he immediately calls a meeting. And I think it's important to understand what is going on at this time. We tend to associate the rescue with snow and cold and winter. But when Brigham Young received the word that these handcarts were still on the plains, it was a beautiful, warm day. And I think not only his experience on the trails, but the prophetic mantle which he had, told him that there needs to take some action immediately to save these Latter-day Saints. And so he goes forth, and the next day at General Conference gives a great stirring sermon that his talk, he says, is to get the saints and to bring them in before winter sets in. And that's the key word, before winter sets in. On October 6th, the first immigrant companies, just less than 24 hours after the call goes forth, leaves from Salt Lake City to seek these saints. And what is significant about that is that they are less than a day away from the Willie Company when the storms hit. And if Brigham had not acted as he had, there would not have been these Latter-day Saints there to help save these companies. It would be another few days before they got to the Martin Company. And that was just the first group. But during the course of the next few months, one of the great stories of the West where humanity at its best is on display is during this season of rescue, where individuals left their homes to go out and try to save individuals that they had never met before. These were total strangers to them. It's a great fulfilling of the Savior. When saw we this stranger and took thee in and helped thee? This is absolute the great epitome, the great example of this that we have in this time frame. And eventually hundreds of men would go to the rescue of these handcart pioneers. We only know the names of a few of those. Most of those are with the first group of rescuers. There were 27 who left on the 6th, and most of those ended up with the Martin Company when they were in Martin's Cove and trying to cross the Sweetwater on November 4th.
That's one of the things that has crossed my mind, what these rescuers did for a living, what type of families they had, that they could just pick up and take off for almost 2 months to be able to do this. And I'm not even sure if it was their families or their occupations or whatever was that much of an issue because of the great need that they felt in making this rescue.
There was a great need, and they were willing to answer the prophetic call. It was a great issue in the sense that not only were they risking their lives in the cold and the snow, but most of these individuals were farmers. They were, and that's how you made your living in Utah. And on a farm, you work year-round. I mean, many of these left to rescue these with crops still in the fields. They didn't know if they would come back and be able to rescue their crops. And if they didn't have their crops, their family wouldn't eat that fall. There was a need for these individuals to be out gathering wood so that they could keep their homes warm and have wood to cook on. But yet they left their homes to go to the rescue of these individuals. So it presented a very precarious situation for everyone involved, not just the handcart pioneers, but for those rescuers.
So we've all heard the story of the crossing through the icy water and those who carried the pioneers on their backs and so forth. But through your study, through your research and the journals that you've read and know quite well at this point, what are some of the misconceptions that we can clear up today?
Okay. For those who are not familiar with the story, this is an account that is frequently told. We hear it nearly every 24th or in July. Frequently this story is told. After the Martin Company, had given up in despair, after all hopes had vanished, after every apparent avenue escape seemed closed, 3 18-year-old boys belonging to the relief party came to the rescue, and to the astonishment of all who saw, carried nearly every member of the ill-fated handcart company across the snowbound stream. The strain was so terrible and the exposure so great that in later years all the boys died from the effects of it. When President Brigham Young heard of this heroic act, he wept like a child and later declared publicly, "That act alone will ensure C. Allen Huntington, George W. Grant, and David B. Kimball an everlasting salvation in the celestial kingdom of God, worlds without end." That's the story that we're talking about that's frequently told.
So not to diminish any part of the story, it would just be nice to know whose account this is and maybe some of the facts associated with it.
This account was written by Solomon Kimball, who's the younger brother of one of those rescuers, David B. Kimball. It was written in 1914, I believe, so nearly more than 50 years after the handcart rescue. And while he's got the essence of the story right, there are elements in there that are incorrect. On that day, where the company left Fort Seminole and traveled to the Sweetwater, we can identify that there were 18 of this first 27 rescuers who were with the Martin Company, helping them get into Martin's Cove and the shelter that it offered. What we know for certain of that, we can identify not 3 but at least 5 of the rescuers who were in the water helping the individuals across. Of those 5 we know by name, none of them were actually 18. The oldest was 24, and what just surprised me as I found this is that there were 3 of them that were younger than 18. There were 2 17-year-olds and a 16-year-old that was doing this heroic action. The story is told that these individuals all suffered and all died as a result of their effort that day. That also does not appear to be the case. They also didn't, while they carried many of the company across, they didn't carry all of the company across. They probably only carried upwards probably about a third of the company, which is not to diminish what they did, because that is still a remarkable thing to do, to help 150 to 200 individuals over the water. And then the issue, as I mentioned before, I was most concerned with, is what was that last statement about promising eternal life. And Solomon Kimball wrote another account where he states that a little bit differently, where Brigham Young said that for these effort alone, these boys will be immortalized. They would become famous. And that certainly is a prophecy that has come true. I think most of us can identify these individuals by name, or if not by name, we at least know their story.
So some of the journal accounts of the actual pioneers that were being rescued is what helped you verify these accounts, saying that they were sort of prioritized in how they were to be carried, either on a back or in a wagon. And that's another thing that I hadn't really heard of or thought about. This is a handcart company with wagons along, and that could easily be used to cross the Sweetwater.
And having set the background, this is what we know about the day. And none of these pioneers, of course, wrote contemporary. They wrote reminiscences, as did the rescuers. But the company was there at Fort Seminole, right where the Martin Handcart, I'm trying to think what the official name of the historic site up there, Martin Handcart site. But they needed to move them away to get them shelter, but they were also camped next to one of the wagon trains. They thought it would be good if they didn't have 1,000 people in one location. So they wanted to move these handcart pioneers into a more secure location. And these folks by that time had endured 2 weeks of cold, reduced rations. It was very hard for them. And on November 4th, when they started to leave, and the leader of the company had written Brigham Young and said, "We will keep moving every day. We will keep moving if we have to shovel snow to do it," because they knew it was important that they get closer to Salt Lake, get closer to help. And by the time that they were getting ready to do this journey, reportedly a third of the company could not walk. And there were others in a horrible situation, but there were only the 18 of them, and what could they do with so many? One of them said, we're like a drop in a bucket. And so they did one of the great lessons that we would do now. I don't know how much experience, this triage, where they looked at the situation and tried to determine what needed to be done. They had, as a company, the Martin Company had at least 7 wagons with them. The rescuers had brought out 10, and we don't know how many wagons they had. So those who couldn't walk, they were placed inside the wagons. There was also a need for them to carry supplies still in the handcarts. So while they abandoned about 3/4 of the handcarts, they still had a quarter of them. Not only did these carry supplies, but there were also those who couldn't fit in the wagons that they placed inside the handcarts. The ones that they kept were the ones who had the canopy on them, the well-built ones. So there were young people that they put inside their children to keep them out of the cold. And when they started out, I'm not sure if they thought as a company that they would need to get these individuals, carry them across the Sweetwater. But when they first left, when the company came to a small creek there called Pete's Creek, there were those that were taken back. They were in such weak condition, we can't cross this creek, was basically what they said. And the company realized that up ahead was the Sweetwater and they needed to do something. So when they started out, the poor ones in poor condition left Fort Seminole with wagons going ahead. The wagons, they would take the poor up to the camp, but it would also use in the wagons to create a path through the snow so that those who were on foot didn't have such a hard time walking through the deep snow. And the wagons would also cut a path across the Sweetwater because it was covered with ice where the individuals could go through without falling through. And then once these individuals with these rescuers got to the cove, the rescuers, they had the responsibility of pitching the tents and finding firewood and building the fire that these saints would need once they got to their new location. We don't know all of those who participated, but this was such a great service to take those in wagons. And a number of these individuals in their reminiscence accounts would talk about the great service these individuals did, pitching their tents, clearing the space, because they would not have had the strength to do it. So that group went ahead on the wagons, and then you had the group that was on foot. And when they got to the Sweetwater, I should mention, when they finally left that day, it had been stormy, overcast, and it was late afternoon, probably close to noon, and they were needing to get to camp as quick as possible before the sun went down. So they were only looking at very few hours, and so they worked out a system where once they got to the Sweetwater, initially the rescuers would carry across children, women, and the elderly, which meant that the men in the company were left to get themselves over the Sweetwater.
More evidence that not everyone in the company was carried across.
No. And, I did some math one time, and for those, the Sweetwater at this point, by all accounts, they entered the Sweetwater at one location, and they went upstream for about 50 yards. So they were in the water for quite a distance. As you know, if you've been there, the Sweetwater just straight across is only about 30 or 40 feet. But they were in there for quite a ways going up because they had to find a place where they could go in, afford to go in, and one to come out. And this is how the trail went through the water. And if these individuals, if three members of the company were to carry these individuals across, assuming they could walk these 100 yards through the mud and the snow and the sleet with everybody on their back, and at a rate of every 3 minutes, it would have taken them 8 hours just for three individuals to get them across.
And based on the time they got to the river, there wasn't enough daylight.
There wasn't enough daylight. There wasn't enough time. And three minutes would have been flying. And it would have taken much more. So they didn't have that luxury. Again, that they're trying to maximize the resources that they have. And we have accounts of members of the company walking through, pulling their handcarts. One of my favorite stories through all this is an immigrant named William Binder, who was one of those left to pull the handcarts through. He's gone through the experience like everybody else, and he goes through and pulls his handcart through. And after he gets up on the other side, he's freezing, he's cold, those fires in the distance look very appealing. He turns around and notices two young brothers who are struggling to get their handcart through the water. And Binder turns around and goes back
into the water
to help these individuals across. And he's not the only one, but he's the only one of the immigrants that we have mentioned by name, of doing this. And while we focus upon those who carried people across, and we don't know if they went all the way up the ford, if they just took them from bank to bank, but there were members of the company who were also in the water, helping push. Company, when I say the company, I mean the rescue company, pushing these handcarts through to help these immigrants. So while they may not have been actually carrying them, the mud on the bottom and everything made it very difficult. And so it was no less taxing to help individuals take the handcarts through the Sweetwater than it was to carry individuals across.
So although we have the account of, and by name, I guess, of these individuals who have become the heroes, as Brigham Young pretty much prophesied, it was not just 3 or 4 or 5 people doing the work.
No, there were 18 doing the work, and it's interesting how it became 3. The first time that the story of the Martin Company was told was about 20 years after the fact, and a fellow named John Jakes, and we may know him. He wrote the hymn, "O Say What Is Truth," writes an article talking about this and mentioning it. And he said, "I would tell you the names of the rescuers if I knew who they were, but I haven't a clue who these individuals were." I mean, they just met them on one occasion. Strangers really took them in.
They were kind of busy to
too busy to introduce themselves. But he said, well, I think one was related to Heber C. Kimball. But he said, I'd give you their names if I knew who they were. And then the following week, he writes his last account. He published these in the newspaper serially over a period of time, to which he says, well, I'm told that the names of 4 of these are David P. Kimball, Alan Huntington, George W. Grant, and Stephen Taylor. And those are the 4 that are given at the time. And Stephen Taylor somehow, later on, when this story is repeated in the history of Utah, for some reason, Stephen Taylor is left out. But Jakes, who we go, did not know who these individuals were. He was just repeating some names. And eventually, rather than the original account, people go back to this other history, and that's where they cite that for some reason the names got left out. And even Ira Nebuchadnezzar didn't appear then, but his family later told the story, and it would seem to fit in with what's going on.
So, having mentioned that brings up the question, why did it take so long? You mentioned 20 years for them to talk about this.
We reverence and revere, rightfully so, our blessed honored pioneers, the handcart pioneers. But at the time, the decisions that were made all the way along, these dominoes that fell that required the rescue, put not only the handcart pioneers in peril, but also the rescuers. And it was not something that was viewed then as it does now. People did not...
It wasn't a heroic thing. It was a tragedy. It
was a tragedy. And, people didn't come forward to sit there and say, my family was part of the handcarts or this. It would take a number of years for the church to come to grips with this. And the reason why John Jakes even wrote his article was he was trying to plead for the saints to forgive them of their PEF debt. And saying, we went through a hard time. After this, do we really need to pay? We've paid one way. Do we also have to pay for it financially as well? And so that's part of the reason why it took so long.
One of the other stories that I grew up with was one of the survivors who years later stood up in a meeting and in a testimony very fervently said that not one of the handcart pioneers associated with the William Martin Handcart Companies fell away from the church based on what they had learned and lived through. So tell me a little bit more about that.
You're referring to the story of Francis Webster, and this is one of my favorite stories, and he is one of my all-time heroes. But unfortunately, there has been some, as with the story of the rescue, there has been some misinformation that has grown up around this story. And as I studied this, I learned to appreciate the story all that much more, just like I did with the rescue. And because there is a valuable lesson to his story that I think gets overlooked when we put him as just another member of the William Martin companies. And one of the things I discovered was that the real story is, in this case, is much better than the story that has been told. For those who aren't familiar with the statement, Francis Webster was living in Cedar City, and in about 1904, as near as I can tell, there was a discussion in the Sunday school class where it came talking about the William Martin handcart company, and as the story is told, an unnamed old man in the corner of the Sunday school class arose to silence criticism directed towards those who allowed the company to come west. And this is reportedly what he had to say. "I ask you to stop this criticism. You're discussing a matter you know nothing about. Cold historic facts mean nothing here, for they give no proper interpretation of the questions involved. Mistake to send the handcart company out so late in the season? Yes. But I was in that company and my wife was in it." Then he goes on to state that there was not one member, or at least that's attributed to him, who left the company. "I have looked back many times to see who was pushing my cart, but my eyes saw no one. I knew then that the angels of God were there. Was I sorry that I chose to come by handcart? No, neither then nor 1 minute of my life since. The price we paid to become acquainted with God was a privilege to pay, and I am thankful that I was privileged to come in the Martin Handcart Company." I love the motto, faith in every footstep. I think that captures the pioneers so well. I love the concept behind it. But as I've studied the pioneers, I've discovered that there were truly those whose faith grew with every footstep they took. And Francis Webster is one of the great examples of that. There were also those whose faith diminished with every footstep that they took. But there were also those on the journey whose faith pushed them ahead, but they ended the journey with basically the same amount of faith that they started with. But the fact that they finished it would indicate. And while one of those who was with Francis Webster that day and heard his testimony said, "I would gladly pay the same price that he did to get his same testimony." And the beautiful thing about Francis Webster is that he did those heroic acts on the journey, but it wasn't just one; it was continual. He made it his life. And it didn't just stop when he reached Salt Lake. Once he got to Utah, it very much continued. The 3 keys to understanding his story is that he says, "Was I sorry that I chose to come by handcart?" And most of us said, well, is this a case where was he sorry that he left England, to come here? Francis Webster made more choices than that. He was an individual who could have come by wagon, and that was one of the choices that he made. And so, was I sorry I chose to come by handcart? He talks about in there, and one of the things he says, "I have looked back many times to see who was pushing the cart, but my eyes saw no one." And we see famously depicted, we associate this with the snow and the cold and of Martin's Cove and those events. But if you read his story, he's talking about an earlier time when the Lord rewarded him for a decision that he had made, and not necessarily an entire group experience. One of the stories that is we frequently associate, he talks about the angels being there, and we frequently picture it in the snow, as I said. But if you read his words, he talks about sand, not snow. And sand was during the first part of the journey. And you wonder, is this a case where he misspoke? But Francis Webster, on September 15th, at a time when the sand was the greatest, did one of the truly heroic acts of any pioneers. I mean, in my mind, it's equal to those who carried members of the company across the Sweetwater. And And I might just mention here that the story of Francis Webster, as we have it, the story that I read earlier, was recounted first by William Palmer about 40 years after he had heard Francis Webster tell the story. So the phrase in there, no one in the company ever left, no one ever left the company, that's just not historically accurate. But we don't know if Francis Webster said that. What he most likely said is, look to the people that you know here in Cedar City. Nellie Unthank. I don't know if you're familiar with Nellie Unthank. President Hinckley talked about her quite a bit. She was the young woman who had both of her legs amputated at the knees and went on and lived a good, faithful life. Look at the Middletons. He was the doctor in town. These came through the company, and look how faithful they are. I think that's what Francis Webster was talking about. Anyway, Francis Webster joined the church in 1848. So he was 18 years old at the time. And against counsel, the people suggested he stayed. He left for Australia to seek his fortune in the gold fields. He eventually ended up in the California gold rush, made some money, came back later to England, where he came in contact with the church again, met a young woman, and they became engaged to be married with the understanding that he would go back to California one last time to try to make a fortune. And once he'd made his fortune, he would come back and they would get married. And so he left Betsy, his fiancée, went to California and worked in the gold fields for 2 years and he struck it rich. He was one of the few that struck it rich. And when he came back, he and Betsy got married in December of 1855, and with their money, they were going to come to Salt Lake, have a lot of money, and live a good life. And at that time, the call went out for individuals, because of the shortage of money, to consider going by handcart instead. Now, Francis and Betsy faced this challenge. He had just basically worked for 7 years to get money so he could live well as a married young man. And now basically the church is asking him not only to go donate money to pay for others, but also to give up all the things that he was hoping to take to America, the fine china and all these goods that he had worked so hard. And he finally determined to obey counsel. So instead of going by wagon, he went by handcart. And he reports that the difference that he paid for 9 individuals besides himself to go to America. Based upon calculations, that means that he paid twice as much to go by handcart as he would have paid to go by wagon, paying for these individuals. And this was quite a sacrifice for him because his wife, Betsy, was pregnant at this time. And it was more than likely that she would be giving birth along the trail. There's a lot of reasons why he could have gone by wagon. When they get to America, they'd understood that they'd be able to bring some of their goods with them, and that they would be able to put these in supply wagons. And things, as we know, just kind of fell apart because they didn't have enough hand carts, didn't have the supply wagons. So what you find in a matter of a few weeks, Francis Webster has gone from going by wagon to now sharing a handcart. He thought when he got to America he would have his own handcart because that was what he was promised. Well, that didn't happen. The supply wagons didn't happen. So he ended up leaving more of the world's goods in Iowa City. And then on top of that, he allowed the individuals who he shared the handcart with to drive the supply wagon. So it means that, again, he went from a wagon to now pulling not only his goods, but this other family's goods as well. And his wife, who was pregnant, really couldn't give him much help. But you see these sacrifices that he's making all the way along. It wasn't just enough to be on the journey. Things continued. The sand, he mentions in his testimony about the sand. And there's one day that September 15th, it's during the sandiest part of the journey, and I think when he talks about, did I know that the angels were with me, and I look back, and I couldn't see anyone, but I knew that they were there. I'd like to envision in my mind that he was talking about this day in the sand, because after they'd left Florence, Nebraska, they had put in an additional 100 pounds of flour. This was at a time when the handcarts were at their heaviest, in the deepest sand. And all of a sudden they start this day. The company travels 22 miles. 1 mile into the journey, one of his fellow handcart pioneers, James Blake, who has been sick, sits down beside the road and says, I can't go any further. You've got to leave me here. And Blake records in his journal, and his is the only daily account of a handcart pioneer, that Francis Webster came to him and persuaded Blake to eventually get on his handcart. And Francis Webster pulled him that day by himself through the sand when it's at the deepest, when he has an additional 100 pounds of flour as it is, and then puts an additional 100 pounds on top of this, and he is left to himself to pull these handcarts. If he wasn't human, and I'm sure he was, I'm sure somewhere along the line he's thinking, am I a big schmuck? What have I done? What have I done? If I'd gone by wagon, my wife could give birth any moment now. If I'd gone by wagon, we could be there. Not only am I pulling this handcart, but I'm pulling this individual. And I think the Lord recognized his sacrifice and came to his aid. And I hope we've all had that experience where we've received the assurance when we have done something that we know that the Lord recognizes us and is there to help us. And I think that's when he's talking about with the angels pushing his handcarts is that particular day.
What are some of the things that we can take from this story? People back then learned a lot. I know that much, and appreciated all the efforts. What can I learn?
There's several aspects of it that I think that we ought to learn from this. The responsibility that we have to our fellow man to go out and to the rescue. I mean, the call that President Monson gives forth, the need to look out to the one and to rescue. And that's, and not just those that we know, but also those who may be strangers who are in need. This was a group, again, I mentioned, the Savior's teachings in Matthew. When saw we thee an hungered, in thirst, in prison? And these individuals were all in that group together. I mean, they were hungry. They were naked. I mean, they'd given up their clothes. They were in basically a prison from which they could not rescue themselves, that these individuals went out and helped them in all of these situations. That is one of the lessons I hope that everyone comes out and learns. We tend to focus upon the handcarts and the faith and the works of these brave saints who undertook the journey. But sometimes we overlook the other aspect, the rescue, which is as compelling and as equally as wonderful of a story. The second thing that I think individuals need to remember through this, and this is the issue that concerns me, is that nowhere along the line are we ever taught that we are saved by one act alone. That we are rewarded for all the good that we do, but that we need to endure in faith to the end, which means continue to live the gospel principles and do the things that we have been asked to do. And the scriptures are very clear about this. I think one of the prime examples that we can relate to equally is David. he did a great thing to save Israel in going forth against Goliath, but yet there were some issues there, and the scriptures talk about him that he fell. And when I wrote this article, I was wondering how it would be received, because this is a favorite story of the Latter-day Saints. It's one of my favorites as well. But I had a number of people who had come up to me and said, it helped clarify my thinking. I was of this view that if I just did one act, I always wanted to just find that one heroic act. If I could do it, I would be set for life. But now I better understand my responsibility as a Latter-day Saint.
And even these rescuers who purported to have done the one act went on and endured well. According to your writings, they lived relatively long lives, served missions, had families, just continued on and endured to the end.
They did. They continued to do the things that were asked of them. One of the stories is told that is that they all died, and some of us view it as a result of their work there, and some of us view it as happening immediately afterwards,
6 weeks afterwards,
or
whatever,
that day, or. But I mean, the last one died in 1920, which is 64 years after the rescue, and these guys went on and did the things that they're asked. They went and served 5-year missions to England, in one case. Another 3 years. One individual, Ira Nebeker, he was a bishop for 35 years. They continued to do the things that they were asked. David P. Kimball, he was called to help settle near Bear Lake, up in that area. And after he'd got his home built, he was called to go down to Arizona. And he left his beautiful surroundings there and went down and helped settle Arizona. These guys continued to exemplify through the rest of their life what they had done in 1856. And I think that's an important lesson to remember.
And probably at the time they didn't consider what they did heroic, probably just doing what they were asked.
They were doing what they were asked to do. In fact, there's a great statement where these guys say that, we're just doing what we've been called. Yeah, I think in later lives, as they understood, they appreciated so much more what they had done, because it really was. There were a number of individuals who died in the William Martin Handcart Company tragically, but after these rescuers got to them, the number of deaths dropped dramatically. That these guys did make a difference, and I think that they understood that.
Thank you. We've been talking today with Church Archivist Chad Orton about the Sweetwater Rescue and the story of the Martin and Willie Handcart Companies. Chad, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.